The sun was just beginning to set behind the rows of houses, casting a soft orange glow over the neighborhood. It had only been a month since my family moved into this quiet suburb, and things had been going smoothly. Almost too smoothly. My mother had always been active in the church, and as the new faces in the neighborhood, we decided to host a gathering for the youth group. Around 25 kids from our church came over that evening, bringing their guitars, their voices, and a shared love for praising the Lord. It was a peaceful evening at first, just kids singing and laughing, praising God as the night deepened. We could feel the joy, the unity in every note. But while we were inside celebrating, something ominous lingered just outside our doors. A neighbor we barely knew, a woman who had kept mostly to herself, had been watching us from the beginning. At the time, we didn't know who she was or what her intentions might be. We didn't know that this seemingly quiet woman harbored feelings that went far beyond the normal irritations of a new neighbor. And, most importantly, we didn't know she practiced something that would soon become very relevant to our story: witchcraft. As the music filled our home and echoed into the night, something strange happened. The lights in our living room flickered. At first, we thought it was just a loose bulb or maybe a power surge. But then the room grew cold, much colder than it should have been for a summer evening. My mother glanced over at the clock. It was only 6 p.m., well before any quiet hours or curfews would apply. She looked out the window, and there, standing by the streetlight, was our neighbor. Her eyes were locked on our house, her face twisted in a look that could only be described as pure disdain. My mom shook off the unsettling feeling and returned to the group, trying to keep the atmosphere light, but I could tell something had shifted. Then, just as suddenly as the flickering had started, the doorbell rang. Not a gentle ring, but a hard, insistent ding-dong that echoed through the hallway. Everyone stopped singing. The joy, the laughter, it all froze in an instant. My mother approached the door cautiously, pulling it open. 2 police officers stood there, their expressions serious. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers said in a deep, authoritative tone. "We received a complaint about noise and potential disturbances happening here." The word disturbances hung heavy in the air. My mother was stunned. "Disturbances?" she asked, clearly taken aback. "We're just having a church gathering, singing hymns. It's only 6 p.m. But the officers looked unimpressed. "Your neighbor," and they pointed in the direction of the woman we had seen standing by the streetlight, called in. She said there was loud chanting and, well, something she described as suspicious activity. It was clear at this point that our neighbor had more than just a noise complaint. Her words carried the weight of accusation. She had framed our simple gathering as something far more sinister. My mother, always calm under pressure, invited the officers inside. "Please, come in," she said, stepping aside. "We have nothing to hide. We're just singing." As the officers entered, the church youth group began singing softly again, this time more hesitantly, as if waiting for permission. The tension in the room was thick. One of the officers, probably feeling the weight of the misunderstanding, cracked a small smile. "Well," he said, "I guess we could use some positive energy tonight. It's been a long day." The officers started to relax, nodding their heads in rhythm with the song. It seemed like the situation would diffuse itself. But just as they began to enjoy the music, the neighbor appeared again, this time standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what seemed to be an exaggerated sense of fear. "There it is," she shrieked, pointing at us. "Do you not see it? They're casting spells, dark magic, right here in our neighborhood." The officers turned toward her, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Her voice, shrill and frantic, had broken the calm. She truly believed, or wanted to make others believe, that what we were doing was dangerous. Her claims had escalated from noise to something darker. One of the officers, clearly annoyed, tried to reassure her. "Ma'am, this is just a youth group singing. There's nothing out of the ordinary here." But she wouldn't back down. "You don't know what you're talking about. I can feel it. They're calling on something unnatural." She clutched at the amulet around her neck, a strange-looking symbol that now made sense in light of her accusations. My mother stood tall, her voice calm but firm. "We are singing to the Lord, nothing more, nothing less." For a moment, I thought the situation was about to spiral out of control. But then something unexpected happened. The second officer, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I think we need more people like this," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "If more people were focused on keeping youth out of trouble and spreading positivity, maybe we wouldn't get so many calls about real crimes." The woman's face twisted in disbelief, but the officers had made their decision. They told us that as long as we kept the volume down after 10 p.m., there would be no issue. The neighbor, however, was told not to call them again unless there was a real emergency. The neighbor stormed off, defeated, for now. But something told me this wouldn't be the last we'd hear from her. As the officers left, my mother turned back to us, a small smile on her face, though I could see the concern in her eyes. The singing resumed, louder this time, as if to reclaim the peace that had been stolen by the accusations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had been stirred that night. Later, we learned from another neighbor that the woman practiced witchcraft and had been known to stir trouble for anyone who didn't fit into her worldview. She believed that our faith and our gatherings were a threat to her practices. The realization hit us hard. This wasn't just a noise complaint. This was a battle of beliefs, a clash of light and dark, right here in our new home. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. Our lights would flicker late at night. Unsettling whispers seemed to drift through the air when no one was speaking. And once, while we were hosting another church group, we heard a loud bang on the window, only to find nothing there when we looked outside. My mother, ever the strong believer, would not let these incidents shake her faith. "We are protected," she said, holding up her Bible. "No force can touch us." But the tension with our neighbor continued to grow. We'd see her standing in her yard, watching us with that same cold gaze. She no longer hid her contempt. It was as if she was waiting for something, for us to slip up, to give her a reason to act again. One evening, just as we were about to begin another youth gathering, there was a knock on the door. This time it wasn't the police. It was her. "Enough of this," she snapped, stepping into our home uninvited. "You people need to leave." My mother, calm as always, faced her. "We're not going anywhere," she said. "This is our home, and we have every right to be here." The woman sneered. "You think your prayers can protect you? You think you're safe? You have no idea what you're dealing with." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But then, without hesitation, my mother raised her voice, strong, unwavering. "You have no power here," she declared. "The Lord is with us, and he will not be moved by your threats." The woman froze, her eyes widening. Something in her shifted. She had expected fear, but instead she was met with a wall of faith so strong it left her speechless. From that moment on, the strange occurrences stopped. We saw less and less of her, and eventually she moved away. It was as if her presence had been an attempt to sow discord. But in the end, our faith and unity had won out. Looking back, I realized that what happened was more than just a misunderstanding between neighbors. It was a test of our resolve, of our faith in the face of fear. And in that test, we found our strength. Not just in the songs we sang, but in the belief that, no matter the darkness, we are never truly alone. As time passed, life in the neighborhood returned to a semblance of normalcy. We no longer heard the eerie whispers or felt the unsettling cold. The neighbor who had once loomed over our every gathering, casting shadows with her dark presence, seemed to have faded into the background. But even with her absence, the tension she had created lingered in the air like the last traces of a storm, not quite gone but no longer strong enough to cause real harm. My mother continued to host the church youth group in our home every week, undeterred by what had transpired. But every so often, a flicker of doubt would pass through my mind. Were we truly done with her? Could someone with such malice in their heart really just let go of the hatred so easily? These thoughts gnawed at me during the quiet moments, but I never voiced them out loud. Then, one late evening, while the house was still, my fears were given new life. It was around 11:30 p.m. The youth group had left hours ago, and the house had fallen into that peaceful quiet that comes after a long day of fellowship. I was getting ready for bed when the phone rang. My mother answered it, and after a few seconds of silence, I heard her voice tighten. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice low but stern. I crept down the hallway, stopping just behind the corner, listening. My mother's tone became more intense, but it was what she said next that made my blood run cold. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. We will not be intimidated. She hung up, the tension hanging thick in the air. I stepped out, concern written all over my face. Mom, who was that? She turned to me, her face calm, but her eyes betraying her worry. It was her, the neighbor. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did she want? She didn't say much, my mother replied, her voice steady. Just that we should prepare ourselves, that something was coming. I stared at her, fear bubbling up inside me. Do you think she? But my mother cut me off, her voice firm. It doesn't matter what she thinks. We will continue as we always have, with faith. No one can touch us. Not with God on our side. Though her words were meant to be reassuring, I couldn't shake the dread that had settled deep in my gut. Something was coming, that much was certain. But what? The next day, strange things began to happen again. It started small, just like before. The lights flickered once more, the temperature in certain parts of the house would drop for no apparent reason, and sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard footsteps in the hallways when no one was awake. My mother, ever vigilant in her faith, dismissed these occurrences as the work of a restless mind. We're just imagining things, she'd say, waving away my concerns with a gentle smile. But I knew better. This wasn't just our imagination. This was her, the neighbor, still trying to worm her way into our lives, into our peace. Then the real test came. One evening, the skies darkened with a heavy storm that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows. We had just finished another youth group meeting, and the last of the kids were leaving when the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. My mother calmly lit a candle, unshaken by the storm outside. It's just a storm, she said, her voice calm. It'll pass. But then, there was a knock at the door. At first, we thought it was one of the church members returning. But when my mother opened the door, she found no one there. Just an empty porch, the rain pouring down and the wind whipping through the trees. She closed the door, locking it behind her, but I could see the unease in her eyes. Something wasn't right. We sat in the living room, waiting for the storm to pass, when the knock came again. Louder this time. More insistent. My mother stood up, her face set in determination. Stay here, she told me. She walked to the door and threw it open. Again, no one was there. But this time there was something else. Lying on the doorstep was a small, strange object. It was crudely shaped, made of sticks and twine, and looked like some kind of charm or talisman. My mother stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and throwing it into the trash without a word. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. The eerie occurrences seemed to fade once again, but the weight of what we had seen, the strange talisman on our porch, the power outages, never truly left us. Then, one afternoon, while my mother was out running errands, I heard a knock on the door. My heart raced as I walked toward it, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw her. The neighbor. She stood there, drenched from the rain, her eyes burning with an intensity I had never seen before. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But before I could act, she spoke, her voice muffled through the door. I told you to prepare yourselves, she said, but you didn't listen. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door. I didn't answer, and after a moment she turned and left, disappearing into the storm. When my mother returned, I told her what had happened. She listened quietly before nodding. This has gone on long enough, she said. It's time to put an end to this. That night, we held another church gathering, but this time, something was different. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a determination to face the darkness that had been hanging over us for so long. As the group began to sing, I noticed my mother standing by the window, watching. I followed her gaze, and there, standing across the street, was the neighbor. She was watching us again, her face twisted in anger. But this time, my mother didn't flinch. She walked to the door, opened it wide, and stepped outside into the rain. The singing grew louder, filling the air with the sound of praise and faith. The neighbor stood frozen, as if torn between her anger and something else, something weaker. My mother raised her voice, her words strong and clear. You have no power here, she called out, her voice unwavering. Leave us in peace. Your hatred will not stand against the love and faith in this house." For a long moment, the neighbor stood still, her eyes wide and unblinking. Then slowly, she backed away, her face pale and her expression unreadable. She never returned. From that day forward, the strange occurrences stopped completely. The house was filled with peace once again, and the gatherings continued without interruption. Our neighbor moved away shortly after. Her house sold to a new family who greeted us warmly when they arrived. We never saw her again, but the memory of what had happened remained with us. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles we face aren't physical, they're spiritual. And in those moments, it's not fear or anger that gives us strength, but faith. As I look back on that time, I realize that the challenges we faced were not meant to break us, but to strengthen us. We stood firm in our beliefs, and in the end, that was what saw us through. Our house remains a place of worship, a beacon of light in the neighborhood, and every time the youth group gathers to sing, I remember that stormy night. The night when darkness tried to push its way into our lives, and we stood together, unshaken, with faith as our shield. With our troublesome neighbor gone, it seemed like a heavy cloud had finally lifted from our home and the entire neighborhood. The days following her departure were filled with a sense of relief, as though we had narrowly escaped something much darker than we had first realized. The house felt lighter, warmer, and the youth group gatherings resumed with even more energy than before. We had triumphed, or so we thought. For the next few weeks, life seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. My mother continued to lead the youth group with grace, the house always filled with laughter, music, and the sound of worship. The darkness that once loomed over us felt like a distant memory. We didn't speak of the strange occurrences anymore, the flickering lights, the eerie cold. Those things were locked in the past where they belonged. Yet, even with that newfound peace, I could sense something was still unsettled. Maybe it was the silence that followed, the abrupt absence of the neighbor who had once been the source of our tension. Or perhaps it was just the residue of what we had endured. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. It started with a dream. The first one came to me on a quiet night after another joyful youth group meeting. In the dream, I was standing in our living room, the house bathed in a soft, warm glow. The sounds of laughter and music filled the air, just as they did every week. But as I looked around, something felt off. The light began to dim, and the laughter slowly faded into silence. I looked toward the door, and there she was, the neighbor. She stood just outside the window, her face expressionless, her eyes cold. She said nothing, but the longer I stared at her, the more I could feel something shifting around me. Then, suddenly, the window shattered. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, drenched in sweat. It was just a dream, I told myself, but it felt so real. I didn't tell my mother about the dream. I didn't want to worry her. After everything we had been through, the last thing we needed was more fear. But the dreams didn't stop. Night after night, I would find myself standing in that same room, watching as the neighbor stared through the window, her presence growing darker, more menacing with each dream. Each time the window would shatter, but it was as if I could never reach her, never confront her. The dreams weren't the only strange thing happening. Over the next few days, subtle signs of something off began to creep back into our lives. It wasn't like before, no flickering lights or cold drafts, but there was something, almost imperceptible. It was small things. I'd hear faint knocking at the door late at night, but when I'd check, no one was there. Objects in the house would move slightly out of place, barely noticeable at first, but enough to give me pause. The atmosphere was tense, but it wasn't anything we could clearly explain. Then one evening, as the youth group was leaving after another successful gathering, I overheard two of the older boys whispering by the front door. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" the other replied. "I thought I heard someone outside knocking or something, but no one's there." They didn't seem too bothered by it, but my heart sank. It wasn't just me. My mother noticed my unease and gently pulled me aside. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to tell her about the dreams. "I keep seeing her," I said quietly. "In my dreams, she's outside the window, watching us, and then the window breaks. My mother's expression softened, and she pulled me into a reassuring hug. "It's just a dream," she whispered. "She's gone, and she can't hurt us anymore." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But deep down, I knew something was still lurking, just out of sight. It was a stormy night, much like the one when we had first confronted the neighbor. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind howled through the trees. I was sitting by the window, watching the storm, when I noticed something strange. Someone was walking down the street toward our house. At first, I thought it was just a passerby, but as they drew closer, I realized they were headed straight for our door. My stomach knotted with fear. I strained to see through the rain, and then I saw it. The figure had stopped directly in front of our house. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring. I couldn't make out their face through the rain and darkness, but I knew. Somehow, I knew. I ran to my mother, breathless. "Someone's outside," I cried. She quickly followed me to the window, but when we looked, the figure was gone. Vanished, as if they had never been there at all. My mother tried to calm me down, reassuring me that it was probably just a trick of the storm, a shadow cast by the wind. But I knew better. I could feel it. Something, or someone, was coming. The next week, the atmosphere in our home had shifted once again. The peace we had fought so hard to restore was hanging by a thread, and we could all feel it. The youth group gathered as usual, but there was a palpable tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. And then, just as we were finishing a hymn, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't like the soft knocks I had heard before. This one was loud, forceful, demanding. My mother's face grew serious as she stood and walked toward the door. The room fell silent, everyone's eyes on her as she opened it. Standing on the doorstep was a man we didn't recognize. He was tall, with a weathered face and cold, dark eyes. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and he held a small, tattered book in his hand. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. My mother hesitated for a moment before stepping outside, closing the door behind her. I watched through the window as they spoke in hushed tones, the man gesturing toward the house. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. After what felt like an eternity, my mother returned inside, her face pale but composed. "What did he want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She took a deep breath before answering. "He said he was sent by her," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He said she left something behind." The man had told my mother that before the neighbor left, she had cursed the house, leaving behind an object hidden somewhere on the property. A final act of malice to ensure that her presence would never fully leave us. He claimed to know where it was and offered to help us remove it. My mother, strong in her faith, refused to be swayed by his claims. "This house is protected," she told him firmly. "Nothing she left behind can harm us." The man left without another word, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. But his warning lingered in the air. That night, after the youth group had gone home and the house was quiet, I couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. Could there really be something hidden here? Something that had kept the strange occurrences going all this time? Against my better judgment, I began to search the house. I didn't know what I was looking for, just something out of place, something that didn't belong. Hours passed, and I found nothing. But just as I was about to give up, I remembered the basement, a part of the house we rarely used. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement was dark, damp, and cluttered with old boxes and forgotten belongings. I moved carefully, shining the light into every corner, every shadow. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, behind an old shelf, there was a small wooden box. It was covered in dust as though it had been there for years, but something about it felt wrong. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to open it. Inside was a small, strange-looking charm, much like the one we had found on our doorstep months ago. I felt a chill run down my spine as I held the charm in my hand. This was it. This was what she had left behind. I ran upstairs to show my mother, my hands trembling. She took one look at the charm and nodded, her expression serious but calm. "We need to pray," she said simply. And so we did. That night, we gathered together as a family and prayed over the house, over the charm, over everything we had been through. My mother's voice was strong and unwavering, and as we prayed, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a peace that I hadn't felt in months. We took the charm outside, buried it in the ground, and prayed for protection. And from that moment on, the house was truly free. The strange occurrences stopped, the dreams ended, the neighbor's presence, once so strong, faded into nothingness. We had finally broken the hold she had over us. The weeks that followed were filled with joy and relief. The youth group meetings continued, and the house once again became a place of light and warmth. We never saw or heard from the neighbor again, and the shadow she had cast over our lives was gone for good. But the experience left us changed. We had faced something dark, something that had tested our faith in ways we hadn't expected. And in the end, it was that faith that saw us through. Our home became a beacon of hope, not just for us, but for the entire community. And every time we gathered to sing, we were reminded of the power of love, faith, and resilience in the face of darkness. The trials we had faced had only strengthened us, and we knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together with unshakable faith. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, the sense of unease that had once clouded our home finally lifted completely. There was no longer a lingering fear of dark presences, no more unexplained happenings that sent chills down our spines. The youth group gatherings were filled with more joy than ever, and our home became a symbol of resilience and faith in the neighborhood. It was as if the house itself had undergone a transformation, reflecting the light we had fought so hard to protect. But with peace came reflection. My mother, always strong and composed, began to share her thoughts on what had happened with us, explaining that it had been more than just a physical or spiritual struggle. It had been a lesson in faith, in trusting in the power of God to see us through the darkest of times. "Do you see now?" she said to me one evening as we sat in the living room, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. What we faced wasn't just about our neighbor or the strange occurrences in the house. It was about standing firm in our beliefs. When we are strong in our faith, nothing, no darkness, no fear, can truly touch us. Her words stayed with me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The storms we had weathered had passed, and in their wake, we were stronger, more united as a family and a community. As time went on, word of our ordeal spread among the local church community. People who had heard about the strange happenings in our home came to us for guidance, asking how we had maintained our faith in the face of such adversity. My mother, always the source of wisdom and comfort, spoke to them with calm conviction, sharing the power of prayer and the importance of unwavering belief. One Sunday morning, after church, a woman approached my mother with tears in her eyes. "I heard what your family went through," she said softly, "and I've been struggling with something similar. It's not the same, but I've felt a darkness in my home that I can't explain. How did you keep your faith?" My mother placed a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. "It's not easy to stand strong when you're facing something you don't understand," she said gently. "But the key is to trust in God's protection. You may not see Him working, but He is always there, shielding you from harm. Faith isn't about not being afraid. It's about trusting that, no matter how dark things seem, God will bring you through." The woman nodded, wiping away her tears, and my mother offered to pray with her. It was a beautiful moment, one that showed me how much we had grown through the experience, not just in our faith, but in our ability to share that faith with others. One day, a few months after the final confrontation with the neighbor and the strange man who had come to our door, I found myself thinking about the object we had buried, the strange charm that had been left behind. My curiosity got the best of me, and I asked my mother if she ever thought about it, or if she wondered why it had such an effect on us. My mother smiled at my question, as if she had been expecting it. "It wasn't the object itself," she explained, "but the intent behind it. People can use symbols, charms, and even words to try and instill fear in others. But the true power behind those things comes from whether or not you allow them to take hold of you. The moment we gave that object any significance, it began to have an effect on us. But when we buried it and prayed over our home, we took away that power. That's why everything stopped." her words made sense. It wasn't the physical object that had caused the disturbance. It was the fear it had sown in our hearts. And once we reclaimed our faith and refused to let that fear control us, the darkness that had clung to our home vanished. It was a powerful realization, one that changed the way I viewed the world around me. I understood now that faith wasn't just about attending church or singing hymns. It was about holding on to the belief that no matter what challenges or evils might come your way, you are never truly alone. God's presence is always there, even in the darkest moments. Several months after our ordeal, a letter arrived at our doorstep. It was from the new family that had moved into the neighbor's old house. They had heard about what had happened between us and the previous owner, and they wanted to assure us that they were a different kind of family, one that believed in community, faith, and unity. In the letter, they wrote about how they had begun renovating the house and how they had found a hidden room in the basement that seemed to have been used for rituals or strange practices. They had since cleansed the space, inviting their church pastor to bless the home, and they felt a strong sense of peace afterward. My mother read the letter aloud, and when she finished, we sat in silence for a moment. It was strange to think that, even after all this time, the house next door still held echoes of what had happened. But it was comforting to know that the new family had found peace there. We decided to invite them over for dinner, to welcome them properly to the neighborhood. When they arrived, we shared stories about our experiences, and they told us how, from the moment they stepped into the house, they could feel something was off. But after they had blessed the home, they felt a new beginning had taken root. Their visit reminded us that our journey wasn't just about overcoming a single challenge. It was about understanding that, in every battle, between light and dark, the strength we hold within our hearts is what truly determines the outcome. Their visit reminded us that our journey wasn't just about overcoming a single challenge. It was about understanding that, in every battle between light and dark, the strength we hold within our hearts is what truly determines the outcome. Though life had returned to normal, there were moments, fleeting, barely perceptible, when I could feel a faint echo of what had once been. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a reminder that the darkness we had faced hadn't completely disappeared. It had simply lost its power over us. There were times when I would walk past the spot where we had buried the charm, and I would pause, feeling a strange stillness in the air. But it no longer frightened me. I understood now that whatever presence had once tried to disrupt our peace had been defeated, not by force, but by faith. The memories of that time would always be with me, but they no longer held the weight they once did. They were just memories now, pieces of a larger story that had shaped us, but no longer defined us. As the years passed, our home became known in the community as a place of refuge, a safe space where people could come to pray, to find comfort, and to seek guidance. My mother's reputation as a strong, faithful woman spread far beyond our neighborhood, and people would often come to her for advice, for prayer, or simply to talk. The youth group grew larger, attracting kids from all over town who wanted to be part of something meaningful, something that gave them hope. Our home was filled with laughter, music, and the sound of voices raised in worship, and the darkness that had once tried to claim it was long gone. I often thought back to the stormy nights, the eerie happenings, and the strange encounters with our neighbor. They felt like a lifetime ago, and in a way they were. We had emerged from that time stronger, more resilient, and more united as a family and a community. The future stretched out before us, filled with light and possibility. And as I looked around at the faces of the people who had gathered in our home, some familiar, some new, I knew that we had been placed here for a reason. Our journey had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. We had faced the darkness, and we had triumphed. And now, with hearts full of faith, we were ready for whatever came next. As the days turned into years, what once seemed like a terrible ordeal gradually became a foundational story for both our family and the community that had formed around us. People came to our home not only for gatherings, but also for solace, as if the house itself had absorbed the strength of the prayers and hymns sung within its walls. It became more than just a house, It was a beacon of hope for those seeking refuge from their own storms, both physical and spiritual. Our story, particularly the way we faced the darkness, became something of a local legend. It wasn't long before neighboring communities heard about what had happened to us, and they too sought guidance. My mother's words of comfort and unwavering faith spread, and before we knew it, people were traveling from other towns to hear her speak. She never sought the spotlight, but it found her nonetheless. Her humility and grace spoke volumes, and soon, our home became a place where people felt compelled to seek answers to the battles in their own lives. For me, it was surreal to see how something that had once filled me with so much fear could now be the source of such strength. I often marveled at how the shadows that had once hovered over our lives had been replaced with light. But even as the peace deepened, there were still moments when I wondered about the neighbor who had started it all. The woman who had cast the first stone of misunderstanding and malice. Had she truly moved on? Or was she still out there, harboring the same resentments that had led her to disrupt our lives? These were questions I couldn't answer, and over time I learned to let them go. It was nearly 5 years later, during a particularly beautiful summer, that I found myself confronted by the past once again. Our home was bustling with activity. More families had joined our weekly gatherings, and we had decided to host a community event in the backyard, a celebration of the peace we had worked so hard to create. The air was filled with the smell of barbecue, laughter, and music. Everything seemed perfect. As I stood by the grill, helping serve food to some of the younger children, I noticed a familiar figure walking up the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. It was her. The neighbor who had disappeared all those years ago. Her presence was unmistakable. Her hair had turned gray, and her once rigid posture seemed to have softened with age, but the intensity in her eyes remained. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. My mother, who had been speaking with some of the guests, noticed her too. I watched as my mother's face registered the shock, followed by something more subtle, an understanding. My mother walked calmly toward her, her expression gentle but firm, as always. I followed, my mind racing with questions. What did she want? Why had she returned? "Can I help you?" my mother asked, her voice as kind as ever, though her eyes betrayed a cautiousness I hadn't seen in a long time. The neighbor, who had once stormed into our home with accusations and malice, now stood before us with a different demeanor. Her eyes no longer held the same hatred, and as she spoke, there was a tremor in her voice I hadn't expected. I came to apologize," she said quietly, her gaze falling to the ground. "I've been away for a long time, and in that time I've had a lot to think about. I know I caused you and your family pain. I see now that I let my own fears and beliefs lead me down a dark path." Her words hung in the air like a confession, and for a moment no one spoke. The guests in the backyard had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding. I felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, and a strange sense of relief all at once. My mother, as if sensing the weight of the moment, stepped forward and placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "You're here now," she said softly. "That's what matters." I was taken aback by my mother's immediate forgiveness. How could she let go of the past so easily? But as I stood there watching the scene unfold, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing ourselves from the burden of the past, about releasing the grip that pain and anger had over us. The woman, who had once been the source of so much fear, began to cry. My mother led her to a quiet corner of the yard, where they sat together, talking in hushed tones. I didn't hear everything they said, but from where I stood, I could see the tension easing from the woman's face. It was as though she had been carrying a heavy weight for years and was finally letting it go. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and people began to leave, I asked my mother about what had happened. "Why did you forgive her so easily?" I asked, still trying to wrap my head around it. My mother smiled softly, as though she had been expecting the question. "Because forgiveness isn't about her," she explained. "It's about us. Holding on to anger or resentment only keeps us tied to the past. She came here seeking peace, and who am I to deny her that? Besides, haven't we all made mistakes we wish we could undo?" Her words hit me hard. I realized that, in my heart, I had been holding on to the fear and anger from those years. Even after the peace had returned to our home, it was time to let go. As word spread of the neighbor's return and her apology, the community's reaction was mixed. Some were skeptical, wondering if she truly deserved forgiveness after everything that had happened. Others, inspired by my mother's example, embraced the idea that redemption was possible, even for those who had caused harm. In the end, it wasn't about whether or not she deserved forgiveness. It was about healing. For her, for us, and for the community as a whole. She began attending our weekly gatherings, though at first she stayed on the outskirts, observing quietly. Over time, she began to participate, joining in the songs and conversations. It was a slow process, but bit by bit she became part of the group. The more she opened up, the more we learned about her own struggles, how loneliness, fear, and misguided beliefs had led her down a path of isolation. What had once been a source of division was now becoming a source of unity. Her transformation reminded us all that healing was possible, even when it seemed unlikely. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that the true battle we had faced wasn't with the darkness that had tried to invade our home. It was with the fear and division that threatened to tear us apart. The strange occurrences, the tension with our neighbor, the eerie sense of something lurking just out of sight, it had all been a manifestation of the fear we allowed to take root. But we had faced it. We had stood together as a family and as a community. And in the end, it wasn't just our faith that had seen us through. It was our willingness to forgive, to embrace those who had once been our enemies, and to move forward with love instead of hate. The lessons we learned during those years would stay with me for the rest of my life. They shaped who I became, and they taught me that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way through. It may not be easy, and it may require more strength than we think we have, but there is always a way. Years later, as I stood in the backyard of our home, watching a new generation of youth gather to sing and celebrate, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The journey we had been on, the trials, the fears, the moments of doubt had led us here. Our home, once filled with uncertainty, was now a place of peace, love, and connection. The neighbor, who had once been our greatest source of fear, had become a friend. She too had found peace, and together we had built something stronger than any of us could have imagined. As the sun set on that beautiful evening, I realized that the real story wasn't about the darkness we had faced, it was about the light we had found together. And in that light, we had discovered the true meaning of faith, forgiveness, and community. As time passed, the legacy of what we had endured and overcome became part of the community's fabric. Our house was no longer just a gathering place for the youth or a beacon of faith. It had become a symbol of resilience and reconciliation. People from nearby towns, church leaders, and even families we had never met began visiting us. They had heard the story of how darkness and division had been met not with anger or retaliation, but with love and forgiveness. My mother's teachings about faith, forgiveness, and the power of unity became renowned far beyond our neighborhood. She was often invited to speak at churches and gatherings, where she would share the journey we had gone through. Every time she spoke, it was as if she relived those moments, but her message was always the same, that even when faced with what seems like insurmountable fear or hatred, the answer is always found in faith and compassion. The woman who had once been our enemy, the neighbor who had instilled fear and mistrust, became a part of these gatherings as well. She never sought the spotlight, but her presence was undeniable. She became a living testament to the power of transformation, a symbol that even the hardest hearts could change. Though many in the community had initially been wary of her, over time they too embraced her, following the example set by my mother. Our neighborhood, once fractured by the tensions and misunderstandings of the past, had transformed into a place of remarkable unity. What had started as a struggle between light and dark, between faith and fear, had evolved into something much more powerful. The youth group continued to grow, attracting children and teenagers who sought more than just a place to hang out. They came for the sense of belonging, the feeling that they were part of something bigger. The gatherings became more than just weekly events. We began to host regular community service days, where we would help elderly neighbors with yard work, organize charity events, and collect donations for those in need. It was an extension of the love and faith we had cultivated in our home, and it spread like wildfire. The community, once divided, was now thriving with a shared sense of purpose and connection. Our neighbor, once so isolated in her beliefs, became one of the most active participants. Her involvement in these activities helped to cement the bonds she had formed with the community. She would often tell people how, for years, she had lived in fear. Fear of change, fear of people who believed differently than she did, fear of anything she didn't understand. But through the love and forgiveness extended to her, she had found a new path, one that allowed her to be part of something greater. It wasn't an easy road for her. There were still moments when she struggled with guilt, when the weight of her past actions seemed too heavy to bear. But every time, my mother and others in the community reminded her that forgiveness wasn't just for those she had hurt, it was for her too. Forgiveness had given her the chance to start over, to build something new. As I grew older, I realized just how much the events of those early years had shaped me. What I had witnessed, the fear, the forgiveness, the transformation, had become a core part of who I was. I had learned firsthand that faith wasn't just something you practiced on Sundays, it was something you lived, something that informed every decision, every interaction. The youth group that had once been a small gathering of a few kids had grown into a community-wide initiative. We began to mentor younger children, teaching them the values of love, compassion, and forgiveness that had become the foundation of our lives. We organized camps, retreats, and service projects, all aimed at fostering a sense of unity and purpose among the next generation. One of the most powerful moments came when, at one of these retreats, a young boy stood up and shared his story. His family had recently moved to the area, and they had been struggling to fit in. He talked about how he felt out of place, how the kids at school made fun of him for being different. But then he found the youth group, and everything changed. "Here, I'm not different," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Here, I belong." His words struck a chord with everyone present. It was a reminder that what we had built was more than just a social group. It was a safe haven for those who felt lost, a place where anyone could find acceptance and love. I looked around at the faces of the kids in the group, some of whom had been with us since the beginning, and I realized just how far we had come. What had started as a response to one woman's hatred had blossomed into a movement of love and inclusion that was changing lives. But as we all know, life isn't without its challenges. Just when we thought we had moved beyond the trials of the past, new ones emerged. There were moments when our faith was tested again. Moments when disagreements flared up, when misunderstandings threatened to unravel the progress we had made. One such moment came when a new family moved into the neighborhood. They were different from most of us, and at first, they kept to themselves. Some in the community, particularly the newer residents who hadn't been around for our original struggles, began to view them with suspicion. The whispers started again, the same kind of whispers that had once plagued us. People wondered why this family didn't join the gatherings, why they didn't participate in community events. It was a familiar feeling, one that reminded me all too much of how things had been with our former neighbor. But this time, we were ready. My mother, ever the leader, reached out to the family, inviting them to one of our gatherings. They were hesitant at first, but eventually they agreed. The moment they walked through our doors, I saw the tension melt away. They had been nervous, unsure of how they would be received, but the warmth of the community quickly put them at ease. It didn't take long for them to realize that this was a place where they could be themselves, where they wouldn't be judged for their differences. In time, they became just as active in the community as anyone else, and once again, we had overcome the forces that sought to divide us. As the years went on, I began to take on more responsibility within the community. My mother, though still the heart and soul of our gatherings, started to step back, allowing me and others to lead. She had built something incredible, something that would endure long after she was gone, and she knew it was time to let the next generation carry the torch. I took pride in continuing the work she had started, in ensuring that the values of faith, forgiveness, and unity remained at the center of everything we did. But even as I grew into this role, I never forgot the lessons she had taught me, the strength she had shown in the face of fear and adversity. One evening, after a particularly successful event, my mother and I sat together on the porch watching the sunset. The house was quiet, the last of the guests having just left, and the air was filled with a sense of calm. "Did you ever imagine we'd come this far?" I asked her. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of years. "I always believed we would," she said softly, "because I believed in the power of love. When you build something on love, it can't be torn down." Her words stayed with me long after that night. I realized that what we had built wasn't just a community. It was a legacy that would continue to grow and evolve long after we were gone. Looking back on everything we had been through, the darkness, the fear, the challenges, I realized that those moments had been necessary. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to grow into the people we had become. The trials we faced didn't define us, but they shaped us in ways we couldn't have predicted. Our neighbor, who had once been the source of so much pain, had become a friend, a reminder that even the most broken relationships could be healed. The youth group had become a thriving community, a place where people of all ages came to find solace and connection. And our home, once filled with uncertainty, had become a beacon of light for everyone who walked through its doors. As I stood in the backyard one evening watching the sun set over the horizon, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. We had faced the darkness, and we had come out the other side stronger, more united, and more filled with love than ever before. And as long as we held on to that love, I knew that no challenge, no storm, no darkness would ever be able to tear us apart. As I settled into the leadership role within the community, I often reflected on the long journey we had taken. Our neighborhood, once fractured by fear and misunderstanding, had become a place known for its warmth and inclusivity. But the work never stopped. There were always new people to welcome, new challenges to face, and new lessons to be learned. I could feel that my mother had passed the torch to me in more ways than one, and it was now my responsibility to keep the flame burning. I threw myself into organizing larger gatherings, not just for our neighborhood, but for surrounding communities as well. We began to host regional faith retreats, drawing people from towns near and far. These events focused on the power of forgiveness, love, and community, and how those values could heal wounds that were deeper than anyone realized. During one of these retreats, a man approached me after the service. He had tears in his eyes, and as he spoke, his voice trembled with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "Your mother's words and what she built here, it saved me. I've been carrying a lot of pain for a long time, and I didn't think it was possible to let go. But hearing your story, hearing about the way you forgave someone who hurt you so deeply, it gave me hope." His words touched me deeply, and I could see in his eyes the same battle we had fought so many years ago. He was grappling with forgiveness, with letting go of something that had taken root in his heart. I offered him a seat, and we talked for a long time about his life, his struggles, and the anger he had been holding on to for years. By the end of our conversation, I could see a shift in him, a glimmer of hope that had taken the place of the burden he had been carrying. It was in moments like these that I realized just how powerful the legacy my mother had left behind truly was. It wasn't just about our family's story. It was about how that story could inspire others to find peace in their own lives. In addition to leading the community, I found myself thinking more and more about my own family, where we had been and where we were going. My mother, while still vibrant and active, was beginning to slow down. The years of work, dedication, and leadership had taken their toll, and though she still attended every gathering and spoke at many events, she was gradually stepping back, leaving me to take on more of the day-to-day responsibilities. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, I asked her how she felt about the future, about the path we had taken. She smiled at me, her eyes filled with pride. "I couldn't have asked for a better future than this," she said softly. "I always knew that what we went through would lead to something greater, something lasting. but I never imagined it would be this beautiful." Her words filled me with a sense of gratitude. I knew that everything we had built, the gatherings, the community, the retreats, was a testament to her unwavering faith and strength. She had laid the foundation for something that would endure long after she was gone. "Do you ever think about the past?" I asked. "About how things might have been different?" She paused for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I do," she admitted. "There were times when I wondered what would have happened if I had responded with anger, if I had let fear take over. But every time I think about that, I realize that those moments, those choices, were what shaped everything that came after. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Her words resonated with me deeply. We often think about how things could have been different, how the choices we make ripple through our lives. But hearing her speak reminded me that it was the very challenges we had faced, the fear, the tension, the need to forgive, that had allowed us to grow into who we were today. As the years went on, the next generation of our community began to step forward. The children who had once been part of our youth group were now young adults, ready to take on leadership roles of their own. They had grown up in an environment filled with faith, love, and forgiveness, and it was clear that those values had become ingrained in their hearts. One young woman in particular, Sarah, had been with us since she was a child. She had always been quiet, observing from the sidelines, but as she grew older, she began to emerge as a leader in her own right. Her compassion and kindness were evident in everything she did, and it wasn't long before she started organizing her own events, volunteer projects, charity drives, and youth mentorship programs. One evening, after one of her events, she came to me with a question that I had once asked my mother. "Do you ever wonder how things might have turned out differently?" I smiled, recognizing the uncertainty in her eyes, the same uncertainty I had once felt. "Of course," I said. "But what I've learned is that everything we go through, every challenge, every setback, shapes us in ways we can't always see at the time. The key is to trust that, no matter what happens, we're being guided to where we need to be." She nodded, taking in my words, and I could see that she was already beginning to understand the same truths my mother had passed on to me. The next generation was ready, and they were filled with the same hope and strength that had carried us through so many storms. One crisp autumn morning, after years of leading the community and building something beautiful, my mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. It was a moment we had all known was coming, but it didn't make the loss any easier. She had been the heart of everything we had built, the guiding force behind every decision, every gathering, every act of kindness. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, neighbors, friends, families from other towns, even those who had heard her speak at one of the many retreats she had led. As we gathered to say our goodbyes, I realized just how many lives she had touched. Her legacy was everywhere, not just in our community, but in the hearts of people far and wide who had been inspired by her unwavering faith and her capacity for love. During the service, I stood before the crowd and spoke about the lessons she had taught me, about the strength she had shown in the face of fear, and about the way she had transformed our community through forgiveness. As I spoke, I felt her presence with me, as if she were still guiding me, still offering her wisdom from beyond. "I know she's watching over us," I said, my voice steady despite the tears in my eyes. "And I know that everything we've built, everything she's taught us, will continue to grow. Her love is still here, in every one of us. And as long as we hold on to that love, her legacy will never fade." In the years that followed, I carried on my mother's work, ensuring that the community she had built remained strong. But it wasn't just me, it was all of us. The next generation, led by Sarah and others like her, had stepped into leadership roles, organizing new events, expanding our outreach, and welcoming new members into the fold. Our home, once filled with uncertainty and fear, had become a place of light that shone even brighter with each passing year. The gatherings continued, the youth group grew, and the legacy of forgiveness and faith that my mother had started became the foundation upon which we built a future of hope and unity. Though my mother was no longer physically with us, her spirit was present in everything we did. I could feel her guiding hand in the decisions I made, in the way I spoke to others, in the love and compassion I tried to show in every interaction. Her lessons had become a part of me, and through me, they continued to touch the lives of others. And so the torch she had passed to me was passed on again and again, from one generation to the next, each one adding their own light to the flame. What had once been a small gathering of believers had become a movement, a community dedicated to the values of love, forgiveness, and faith that had carried us through the darkest of times. As I stood in the backyard of our home one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The sky was painted with the colors of the fading day, and the air was filled with the laughter and music of a new generation. We had faced the darkness, and we had emerged stronger. And as long as we continued to hold on to the love that had brought us here, I knew that no storm, no challenge, no force of darkness could ever tear us apart. And so the legacy of love, forgiveness, and faith lives on, not just in our family, but in the community we built together. My mother's wisdom, her strength, her unwavering belief in the power of love continues to inspire us all. And as I look toward the future, I know that her legacy will continue to grow, to touch new lives, and to light the way for those who come after us. It is a legacy of hope, of resilience, and of the unshakable belief that no matter what we face, love will always triumph. As the years passed, the legacy of faith, love, and forgiveness that my mother began continued to grow. What started as a simple act of standing firm in the face of fear had transformed into a beacon of hope for countless others. Our community flourished, built on the foundation of unity and the belief that light can always overcome darkness. And though my mother is no longer with us, her lessons continue to guide us, lighting the way for future generations. Our journey taught us that even in the most trying times, we have the power to shape our lives through compassion, understanding, and a willingness to forgive. No challenge is too great when we stand together in faith and love. And as we carry her legacy forward, we remain committed to spreading this message to all who seek it. If you've been inspired by this story and the values it represents, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. By following, you'll not only hear more stories of faith, transformation, and community, but you'll also become part of a growing movement that believes in the power of love and forgiveness to change lives. Together, we can continue to build a world where compassion and unity lead the way. Thank you for being part of this journey. Remember, no matter what darkness you face, light will always find a way through. Subscribe today and let's continue this journey of faith together.